Hello, everyone. Welcome. Kieran and I are very excited you could join us today for this great program we put together for you. And as we were looking at the attendee list, it's hard not to notice we've got a really diverse group today with representing industries and companies from across the United States and a few abroad. So really excited you could join us today. So moving into the presentation, we thought a place to start would be to give you a little bit of context around who is TalentWave. So with that, just a high-level primer, and this is really our basis for presenting the program today. We are really positioned as the most experienced provider of independent workforce engagement solutions in the country. And to wit, we have over 80 enterprise programs, and any given week we have thousands of independent workers that we're engaging on behalf of our clients so that they can provide their services. We also have a pretty extensive ecosystem of MSP and VMS partners. One of the things we're most proud of as a company is our positioning really as a vendor-neutral partner in the ecosystem, helping companies to work safely and cost-effectively with their contractors. We provide a number of services. Foremost among those is independent contractor compliance, as well as a number of engagement solutions, including agent of record, employment of record, employer of record, which is traditional payrolling solutions, and a number of higher order management services, including vendor qualification, sub-vendor engagement, and also talent re-engagement, literally helping companies build talent communities. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of those observations in the market and some of the work we're doing a little later in the program. To give you a quick overview of what we're going to cover today, we're going to start with an overview of just today's talent environment. So Kieran will run you through a few slides of some data points and observations that we've seen leading into a discussion around the value of looking at an enterprise-wide talent management program. Next, we'll discuss some of the potential sources of talent that are available today in the marketplace, as well as constructing a simple model around talent supply and demand. We'll then lead into kind of the heart of the program, which is helping you present a framework around building a strategy for enterprise talent management. And finally, we'll leave you with some success factors that we've learned from our clients and our field experience, if you will, over the last 20 years of doing this for companies. And if Kieran and I have our timing right today, we should end up with about 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. So please feel free to pose your questions to Holly during the presentation, and we'll do our best to cover as many of those at the end as we can. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Kieran.
Thanks, Kimball. Good morning, everybody. To start, we just wanted to kind of frame the discussion around kind of three of the largest macro drivers that are generating changes in the workforce and generating challenges on HR departments and talent acquisition teams as they go to market to find the workers needed to execute against business plan. And the first one is the growing impending shortage of skilled labor. The McKinsey study, The World at Work, estimates that by 2020, which, used to seem a long time ago, it's not long now. I have children in high school who will be graduating in 2020, so it's upon us. But by then, there's a shortage of 30 to 40 million college-educated workers in the U.S. Additionally, an additional research paper entitled After the Recovery is estimating by next year, 2018, there will be more jobs than people to fill them. So what we're seeing is actually companies are now starting to see that this shortage is imminent. We have 66% of multinational companies saying it's not just affecting timelines and affecting deliverables, it is going to affect their bottom line in the next 5 years. So I guess demand number one and force number one on HR is that HR and talent acquisition are competing in a world where demand is going to exceed supply for the foreseeable future. So with that, we'll go to our first polling question. and ask the question, in your view, is your organization feeling the impact of the talent scarcity? So as you can see, a large percentage. I expected it to be above 50, but 80% is telling that the shortage is here. It's not just imminent. The next slide. So the other thing that we find is, along with the shortage of skilled workers, is the shifting workforce demographics. And I think we all are aware of these, right? We're all aware of the impending exit of the workforce of the baby boomers. And on the other end of the scale, what a large percentage of the workforce will be made up by millennials. What I think is interesting is the numbers can be staggering or even frightening when you see these numbers. As a baby boomer, it's good to know that by 2019, so 2 years from now, all of the baby boomers will be 55 or older. So on the high-end, experienced, aged worker population, we have a huge percentage of workers marching towards retirement, which is going to, again, continue to put pressure on HR departments and on talent acquisition teams who have to plan for a future workforce. Aligned with that, by 2020, again, not too far away, 50% of the U.S. workforce will be millennials. And again, we all make fun of the millennials, and I'm sure we have a lot of millennials on the call, but we do know that they've grown up in a different environment where flexibility is key part of their life, where mobility is a key part of their life, and this will continue to drive stress on HR departments. Which kind of brings us to the last kind of driver, which is non-traditional employment. So as we see baby boomers looking for flexibility, they don't want to fully retire, but they're not ready to continue to work 40 hours. We have millennials who are changing the way work is done. The sands are shifting. The employer no longer defines the workplace. It's rather the employee or the worker's priorities and preferences that are going to dictate the terms of the agreement, whether that agreement is an employment agreement or if that agreement is some kind of a temporary worker agreement. It's around the dictation of what will work for the workers. Because some of the other numbers and facts are staggering. 60% of millennials say they plan to leave their job in less than 3 years. So again, massive turnover, massive churn, massive pressure on HR. The average tenure for millennial is 2 years in their job, compared to 5 years for a Generation X, or baby boomers stay 7 years. So more and more turmoil, more and more change, more and more need to be nimble and flexible in your work planning. So all of these trends are what's fueling the war for talent. So what we want to talk about based on those factors is how do you approach and plan for the war for talent. So before we do that, let's go to the next polling question. And we want to ask you folks if a contingent or a non-employee portion of your workforce is growing, stable, or declining. Interesting. A little late swing between the stable and declining. But again, we can see a good portion growing as it becomes a piece of multinational companies' workforce plan and workforce strategy. Thanks, Holly. Oh, yeah, interesting. So what to do? I'm sure many of you are fully aware of the trends, but I don't think a lot of companies realize how imminent it is. and that it is now becoming a mission-critical part of the organization to have a workforce planning strategy that covers the whole enterprise. So the approach we're seeing across a lot of the large Global 500 customers that are in our customer base is, we've heard the word total talent management, but to be honest, total talent management is very large and very complex. We see it more as an enterprise talent management or an enterprise talent acquisition plan that's needed, where a holistic view of the entire workforce drives plans to consider a broad range of options, from full-time employees to outsourcing of either functions or projects that are not either functions that are not core to the business, or projects that can be easily bundled up and outsourced and delivered outside of the walls of the company, of the enterprise, or how to manage it through temp labor, whether temp labor is the traditional staffing model that we've all known for and has been around for 50 years, or a growing number of our customers are coming to us and looking for help with self-sourcing of the independent workers. Again, based on the need for flexibility, we see a huge number of both millennials and baby boomers looking for the flexibility to be independent and work as an independent themselves directly with their end customer and step out of the traditional staffing model. So we'll go to our third polling question, and then I'll hand it back over to Kimball, who'll start to talk about what we believe is the right approach. But for now, can we ask if you can share with us whether your company does directly source independent workers? Interesting. So if I look at this, between the no's and the don't no's, we see a tremendous opportunity for companies to look at an alternative sourcing strategy to find the skilled workers needed in this changing economy. Interesting, we saw a lot of, the first answer said that the scarcity of talent is affecting companies, but a smaller portion are actually using this new and I guess emerging trend in how to source non-employee workers. So with that, I'll hand it off to Kimball to talk a little bit about our proposed approach.
Thank you, Kieran. Yeah, it's fascinating to look at not only these data points, but some of the broader research studies that Kieran shared. Very clear to me that the workforce is changing, the very nature of work itself is changing, and as a result, the broader world of work that we all find ourselves is really evolving rapidly, and we believe companies can take control by choosing to direct source more talent and also choosing to embrace a non-employee or flexible workforce to get a lot of the vital work done inside their company. So with that kind of transition there, at its core, the strategy we're talking about is how do you optimize the mix of the traditional workforce versus this new emerging flexible workforce. And determining the right mix is literally, we think, the million-dollar question, and for some organizations, multi-million, if not billion-dollar question. The truth is, it's hard to answer. Not only is it difficult to put a strategy together, but the answer is going to be different for every company, given the unique circumstances and drivers behind every company. What our goal today is to help present a framework to get you thinking about this and to begin thinking through a structure that might make sense for your company. And there's a number of factors to consider, including, most importantly, talent itself. So if we look at just a model for the workforce, we've all heard as practitioners, labor called many different names, whether it's employee, temp, contractor, freelancer, so on and so forth. We've tried to simplify that and created this model to look at the total workforce. And within that, you can see 5 broad categories, one of which is the traditional workforce, right? These are employees, whether they're full-time or part-time, they work for your company, you employ them as your employee. The others are all in the category of flexible labor, whether they're coming through a temporary agency, whether they're freelancers you found on your own, whether they're independent contractors in the classical definition, or they're consultants coming either individually as an IC or through a consulting firm. There's a number of different categories, and we put this framework together really to help a lot of our clients and prospects get their arms around what we're talking about when we talk about the flexible workforce. So at its core, this is a simplified framework just to look at the different categories of labor. Now, why is this important? Because in the broader construct, this is the supply, right? So all of these buckets together, if you will, create the supply side of the equation. What we want to do to create a model is also look at the demand side. This graph here is just an illustration, but it's meant to show that the demand for labor within an organization is variable. Very seldom is there a fixed demand for work within a company. We often find that driven by economic cycles or different vagaries or seasonality within a company, that their demand for labor varies over time. And in detail, when you look at the type of labor they need, the subject matter expertise they need varies as well. So the central challenge, if we look at this variable demand model in the construct of flexible versus traditional workers, is how do you strike a balance, right? In other words, where do you draw the line of a base of traditional workers as well as a flexible workforce that not only helps you meet peak and valley demand curve criteria, but also helps you attract the expertise you might need to accomplish and achieve certain projects or achieve certain results that your traditional workforce can't accomplish. So this kind of a framework, I think, helps to visualize the enterprise workforce opportunity that Kieran shared. And if we play this out a little bit, you can see that if we draw the line too low, in other words, if you have a very small base of traditional workers and attempt to meet all variable demand with a flexible workforce, it could conceivably work, but it's not optimal, right? What this model in this construct lacks is speed, flexibility, cost savings. You'll end up paying for talent on the spot market. You'll be caught short when you need critical talent. And the long lead time to find workers will cause delays in production. So this kind of approach of understaffing can create a lot of stress within an organization. The other extreme, right, you could also choose to overstaff, right? So obviously this will allow your organization to meet all the needs for labor, but it will cost you in a number of ways, right? You'll have high fixed costs. If there's not enough work to be done, you'll have idle labor, which is never good. Layoffs are typically a knee-jerk reaction that you'll see in various industries as they need to downsize with economic cycles. And as HR practitioners, you all know how challenging it is to lay off full-time employees, traditional workers as opposed to flexible labor. So the flexibility is lost with this kind of a model, and you get suboptimal results oftentimes if you have generalists performing specialized work that ideally is done by someone who's expert in that piece of work. So this type of a model can also create a lot of stress. What we're proposing, and the real crux of the challenge, is to find that right mix, right? So you want to be able to staff your organization with traditional workers for some optimal baseline level, and then build flexible workers and use them for one-off peak or special needs as they come up. And ideally, you're also building a bench of talent that you can bring in, right? A bench of flexible workers that you can bring in on a just-in-time basis to meet not only peak demand, but also expert demand that you may not have within your traditional workforce. This kind of a result, or this kind of an approach, if it's optimized, yields both hard and soft savings for the organization. And certainly sounds great. The challenge, however, is it's not easy. As I said earlier, each company is unique, and the right answer is also going to be unique for each organization. So we're left with the primary goal of how to think about how this could work for your company. In other words, how do you think about matching the right workers from all those different categories to the work within your organization? And ultimately, the secret to optimizing your workforce mix is to make sure you have the right workers doing the right work at the right time. And it does sound, it sounds easy, and we'll be the first to tell you, and as will anyone who's gone down this path, that it's not. And I think a lot of companies are just now beginning to get their arms around how to do it and learning a lot of hard lessons. And part of what we're going to share with you today is a framework for you to begin to think about it so you can also begin to get some experience doing it. The other takeaway here is clearly human resources and talent acquisition play a central role in achieving this kind of a result for the company. To help you think about this at a little bit of a deeper level, we put together a simplified framework, and we like to, in our traditional work, where we're doing compliance and engagement services for clients, we take a very consultative approach. So as good consultants, we'd be remiss if we also didn't have a 4x4 matrix. Little consulting humor there for you. We put together a 4x4 matrix to help you literally categorize what type of worker should be doing what type of work. And in this matrix, there's really two quadrants. Core work, which is really the work that delivers the value prop and the unique positioning of your company, versus non-core work that you could easily be outsourced or done by somebody else. And then the other matrix is the intellectual property. In other words, what unique value add does your company possess and deliver to do its work? So within that, if you look at workers who perform core work leveraging internal intellectual property, that's really the bastion of traditional employees, right? Those are the people you want on your bench. I don't want to use the word you own them, but you certainly are their source of income, and they are loyal to you and you're loyal to them. Whereas the other categories of workers could be performed by flexible workers. And if we drill down into that flexible worker component of this model, we're left with workers who are performing core work but bringing in external IP, in other words, knowledge and experience and a tool set outside of what your company possesses. That's the traditional realm of consultants. Everything from McKinsey on down, consulting firms, that's part of their value they bring in, is that experience and best practices and intellectual property to work on your projects. If you slide across into non-core work, traditionally you'll see independent contractors there, and we've drawn an arrow in between, because one thing we're seeing more and more of in the marketplace is individual independent contractors who possess a high degree of intellectual property that's proprietary to them, and they are really entering clients and performing high-end consulting work. So there is a spectrum there from independent contractor performing, non-core work, leveraging their own IP, over to independent contractors performing very high-end core consulting work for a client. And in this model, the last quadrant really is the workers performing non-core work, leveraging the company's IP, and typically under the direct management or supervision of a company manager. And this is the traditional realm of temporary agency workers and freelancers that you've sourced on your own. So this kind of a framework, I think, is important to keep in mind as we get into the strategic plan that we'll lay out here in a moment. And with that kind of a segue, I think the strategy is a key part of what we wanted to share with you today. And it's really where the tire hits the road, a high-level strategy that enables enterprise talent model to come to life. And like any strategy, I come from the world of management consulting. In the realm of strategy consulting, it's one thing to have a beautiful strategic plan. it's quite another to execute that strategic plan, and that's the hard part, right? It's pretty simple to pontificate and create an outline and a guide. The hard work is actually executing and doing. So hopefully after today, you'll at least have a framework for the plan, and then can begin the harder work of actually executing that strategic plan for an enterprise workforce model. Now with that, we've created a high-level framework, and I'm going to walk you through the kind of the 9 steps that we determined will help most companies start to get their arms around just how do I build an enterprise workforce model for my company. And it really starts with a simple yet complex task, and that is to map your current org structure, including all the non-employee or outsourced resources that are currently performing work. So the obvious place to start here is with your org chart, and after that, layer in all the supplemental labor or non-employee labor that's actually performing work for your company today. The second step is to clearly define all the work being done within those workers, right? So you've outlined your organization. Now take a look at really defining all the work that's being done, and think in terms of output and deliverables, not just job descriptions, right? You want to try to quantify the actual work that's being performed and be able to measure it in terms of an output so that you can determine how many workers ultimately you'll need to do the work. The third step is to define the skills and experience required for each role. One construct, the one I just shared with you a few moments ago, is to look at core versus non-core and internal IP versus external IP. I've also walked clients through a different model, but similar. You could also choose to look at your work in terms of strategic and tactical, and also look at the workload in terms of variable versus steady or fixed. That may also help you get your arms around, should the worker be in a traditional employee, or can I get away with and leverage the flexible workforce to perform that work? Next, you want to look at establishing the optimal workers to perform the work. Again, following the model we laid out for you, should it be an employee, a consultant, an independent contractor, or a temporary freelancer, someone, a temporary worker provided by an agency or some other source. Step 5 is to then begin to estimate exactly how many workers do you think you'll need in each of those categories. So you want to look at the workloads, and using the frameworks above, begin to think of how many workers within each category am I going to need, and also what sort of flexibility and cushion does your company need, or have you leveraged in the past? Again, there's a gray area here in terms of precision. Most companies choose to over versus underestimate this, and you can always fine-tune it as you move forward. A bit of a sidebar, but we found it's important. As companies go through this, they often find that it's an opportunity to revisit how things are being done. 10, 20 years ago, this was called re-engineering under the auspices of total quality management, TQM, but the principles still apply. So some considerations for you to think about: does all the work still need to be done, and can it be done more efficiently? Can any of it be outsourced? In other words, do we have to do this using our traditional workers? Could it be outsourced either as a process outsourcing or just to some other company? Can it be packaged differently? We find that a lot of work that's being done by traditional workers could easily be projectized, which is a term really to denote that the work could be unbundled. It doesn't need to be performed by an employee. It could be done more in discrete projects by flexible workers. And that may help you to refine your org structure moving forward. In other words, not all the work needs to be done by a traditional worker. You may be able to do it more flexibly and more variably using a flexible workforce. Next, based on your unique business, you'll want to decide on the appropriate mix of full-time equivalent, traditional worker versus flexible worker by category. Some companies choose to go down the approach, and I'm expecting this will be one of the questions we get at the end in terms of where do you start. Some companies don't do this for the enterprise as a whole. They'll pick a group or a specific role or a department to start. Again, use the decision matrix that we've shared with you today as a guide, and make some first order decisions as to what the right mix is for your company. Finally, step 8 is really to take a look at, do a little bit of discovery. Look at who do you have in place today. In other words, if you were to execute the model that you've just built for yourself, what's the talent that you already have in place, both in terms of traditional workers as well as the flexible workforce that you're engaging. And you'll want to ask yourself a few basic questions. Do you have the right people on the bus? Are those people in the right seats within your organization? And where are the gaps? Not only today, but where do you expect them to be in the near term and in the long term? Particularly relevant for those in the HR and talent acquisition space. You need to always have a look at today as well as into the future so you can begin to anticipate and meet demand as it comes. Finally, the last step that we've outlined in this process, once you've determined who the people are and who you have, you'll also want to address how are you going to fill the gaps as well as meet future demand, which we've put under the bucket of sourcing. How do you identify the suppliers of talent so that you can attract and find new workers so that you can ultimately be viewed as that client of choice for the independent workforce, and really supplement your internal and external recruiting using a variety of strategies, including the direct sourcing strategy we've talked about, as well as third-party strategy or suppliers, whether those are temp agencies or some of the emerging online staffing or FMS providers and marketplaces. And finally, you'll want to think about the working relationship that you want to establish between the workers and the organization. Now with that, the next, I forgot step 10. So we threw in a bonus step there, sorry. Clearly this is an iterative process. Much like any good strategic plan, once you have a framework and a first cut, no strategic plan survives contact with the market or with your company without revision and change. So this is an exercise that I think leading edge companies are likely going to look at this on an ongoing basis, at the very least as part of an annual strategic planning exercise. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Kieran, who's going to share some of the best practices and experiences we've learned with our client base.
Thanks, Kimball. So now a very clear 10-step process, but who takes ownership and how do you deliver? And it can't be obviously just HR alone that can be responsible for the building and the delivery of a strategic plan. It takes a village, right? And if you look at the steps and some of the areas that the strategic plan asks you to take a look at, it's going to require a lot of collaboration across the enterprise. It's going to need input from finance. It's going to need input from legal and compliance, but it's going to need a lot of input from the business stakeholders that the HR and talent acquisition teams are working for as their end customer. But from an ownership standpoint, what we've seen is more and more collaboration between HR and procurement. I've been in the industry 16 years, and I would say for the first 12 years, any of the customers and prospects that I worked with, either procurement or HR owned the non-employee workforce. But it was either or. It was like never the twain shall meet. It was kept very, very siloed and very separate. But in the last 3 to 4 years, this is changing considerably. And it makes sense. I mean, think about what we've talked about. We've talked about a need for a broad set of skills across both talent acquisition, HR, and procurement in order to deliver on a workforce plan that's going to be able to compete in a scarcity of talent, workers looking for more flexibility, etc. So I honestly believe in the next 3 to 5 years, we will start to see the emergence of almost a shared service group that combines the workforce planning skill set, the talent acquisition skill set, strategic sourcing from procurement, and supply chain management from procurement. So more and more we're going to see a convergence of the skills and competencies from both teams to deliver the solutions needed to basically keep the businesses up and running and make sure that the workforce is available to execute against executive management's business plan. So how do you go about striking a balance? I mean, Kimball has called out a number of times. It's very different by customer. I honestly believe it's even very different by industry. In industries that use a lot of emerging new technology, you will see a bigger use of non-employee workers, leading edge. In more traditional manufacturing and the like, I think you will continue to see a larger portion of the workforce being full-time employees. But we just put this in to give a guideline as to what it could look like. And it really is unique to your industry and your company. I've worked with a number of large consulting companies where some of them plan for up to 50% of their workforce to be non-employees because they're staffing on and off large projects for their end customers. They're using emerging technologies that they haven't built a core competency within, so they have a plan and a clear strategy to be able to source those skill sets outside of their full-time hiring process. I've worked with a very large West Coast, well-known software company where they had a clearly defined strategy of 30% of their workforce would be temporary. Some of it was seasonal-based. Some of it was just the nature of their work, the nature of software and software releases, product releases and the like, really lend itself to the ability to have a flexible workforce. But I think a clear and thorough plan will start to break out and have targets in terms of what's my target non-employee percentage, and then within that, what are the different sources of labor that we're going to build into our supply chain and be able to fill as needed to serve the business. And then kind of to start to summarize, what we're seeing with our customer base and basically what the TalentWave business model is built on is the fact that more and more of the workforce want to be independent. We have a shrinking workforce. So if you put those two together, a larger percentage of workers in a shrinking workforce is going to be independent workers. We are seeing more and more of our customers asking for strategies around how to manage the independent workers. They'll continue to use traditionally sourced staffing suppliers or consulting companies, but they really are working with us to help them build their own pool of workers that they've used before, workers that have delivered quality and value that they want to be able to use, but also to take that model and stretch it to a lot of the freelance management systems that are coming up in the market. You may know some of the names. Upwork is one that's clearly focused on workers who can deliver work in a number of hours or a few days, to high-end, the hire.coms of the world, where many of our customers are looking for high-end professional IT workers for extended periods, or to a Catalent where they want to outsource a piece of work to a well-qualified business consultant. But how do I put that all together in a strategy? And that's kind of where, as I said, we've built our business model, but where we're seeing a lot of our customers take it in terms of help me manage that. And when we say help manage that, not only is it how do I source these, but how do I manage them? How do I manage my risk? And how do I ensure that the workers are classified correctly so that me and my company are protected from any kind of misclassification lawsuits, either from the workers themselves or from government agencies. So in closing, what we're really seeing is a broad strategy, categorized clearly my full-time, my non-employees, and then within my non-employees, how am I going to manage direct sourcing through a staffing supplier? How am I going to go through my large consulting companies? Or where we're seeing the most questions, where we're seeing the most interest is in how do I manage this burgeoning population of freelancers, of independent workers who want to be able to come in, as one colleague I used to work with, what they're looking for in a relationship is the opportunity to come in, work with a well-known brand and a well-known company, and leave with a better LinkedIn profile than they came in with. So I think with that, we're ready to open it up for Q&A.
All right, thanks guys so much for sharing your expertise and offering some really great best practices in talent acquisition. We have had a few questions come in during the webcast, and I'm sure we can get to those in the time that we have remaining. And HCI members, if you haven't yet submitted questions for Kimball and Kieran, please do so in that question and answer box. So our first question comes from Alina. It's either Alina or Alina. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. And she says, what about hiring in a lab or manufacturing environment where we cannot offer the flexibility that today's quality talent wants?
So, I mean, I would think in an environment like that, the workers coming in looking for that obviously have realized that they don't have the flexibility, but I do think what they're looking for would be a great experience. Like I said, the ability to update my LinkedIn profile so that whether I come in for a 6-month engagement or whether I'm going to be an employee for 2 years, is the work challenging? Is it appealing? Is the environment appealing so that A, the experience is good, and B, I am a better worker with a better, I hate to keep going back to the LinkedIn profile, but do I have a better profile to take to market after the engagement I've had in your lab environment?
You know, I would concur with that answer. And I think a lot of our clients that face a similar dynamic, not only from just recruiting challenges, but also the structure of their work, they're really rethinking their company environment. Many HR practitioners have focused on being an employer of choice for traditional workers. I think the concept of being a client of choice for flexible workers really has validity here because there are many different, to Kieran's point, there are many different ways of structuring work, right? When we think of flexible labor, the traditional sense is to think of an hourly temp, right? But many of our contractors that we engage for clients are long-term projects. And I think, in a lab environment, maybe rethink how you structure some of that work so that it would lend itself to better attracting some of the workers that still want flexibility, but are also willing to make a commitment to achieving an SOW or a certain defined result for you.
All right, awesome. Thanks, guys. And we'll take a question from Jennifer. And she says, she actually wants you to please clarify again, what is the difference between an independent contractor and a freelancer per your definition?
Of course. Yeah, so an independent contractor actually has a very simple yet complicated legal definition, right? And that is at the core of what we do as a business to help companies navigate through the vagaries of the definitions of independent contractor between the Department of Labor, the IRS, and a number of state and other federal agencies. So for us, an independent contractor truly satisfies the federal and state requirements to be categorized as an IC in the locale that they're working. Whereas a freelancer is somebody who is independent, yet they may not actually meet the stringent criteria of being an independent contractor under the tax and worker employment law rules. And we find more often than not that companies who define workers as freelancers, those workers are typically task-based, very short duration projects. They're not the traditional longer-term SOW or deliverables-based project that an independent contractor works under. But that question is one we get often, and I often joke that part of our challenge whenever we work with a new client and implement a program is just baselining the terminology that we use, because oftentimes in practice all these words are used interchangeably, yet some of them have legal definitions and others are just a company's nomenclature for how to categorize workers. But the short answer is independent contractor has a very clear, although vague, legal definition, and that's frankly the core of what we do as a company is help organizations properly classify qualified independent contractors, and also help them engage workers who think they're independent contractors but legally aren't qualified to be categorized in that category.
Yeah, so just to clarify maybe a little bit, so when we go through that classification or evaluation, we would come out and say this worker doing this work does qualify as an independent contractor, and therefore, Mr. Customer, you can engage them under a 1099. Versus that is the definitive independent contractor. A freelancer is somebody who wants to work independently, may not qualify as an independent contractor, and therefore ends up in an employer-employee relationship for the duration that they're going to deliver to an end customer. Hope that helps, because it sounds like an easy question, but there's a lot of nuances to try and clarify.
For sure.
All right, and thank you. And we have a question coming in from Jen, and she says that she is curious to know why outsourcing isn't one of your staffing options in the matrix.
Yeah, I suppose it could have been an additional bucket. For us, the model we put that under is, outsourcing, I think, would fit in the consulting bucket if we were to add a clarification there, because you're really looking at outsourcing a full function. I suppose I could add another column. We debated that chart extensively, because the stated purpose was to help simplify and clarify, and outsourcing certainly, I think, that's a good clarification. So I might choose to do that moving forward.
All right, cool. Thank you. And we have a question that asks, this comes in from Connie, and she says, HR tries to stay out of contracting to avoid employee-employer relationship. Is this concern changing, and how do you expect regs to change?
Yeah, boy, that's a great question. Maybe we can take that in reverse order. So, we clearly have a new administration that I think is more business friendly than the prior one. Whether that's going to translate into being able to impact the legislative environment and the legal worker definitions that exist today, which are really just you're either an employee or you're an independent contractor of someone, that remains to be seen. There's been a lot of discussion, I think, in the industry around the mythical third category of worker, somewhere between an employee and a true independent contractor. The other question around HR staying out of contracting, part of our role as a company is to offer engagement solutions where we can literally be in the middle of that equation and can be a contracting vehicle on behalf of the company to engage non-traditional labor. So, I think that it's a constantly evolving mix, and we'll see if legislation changes here over the next 4 years with the current administration. But as it stands today, we're left with what's on the books, and that is a fairly clear and rigid determination of employee versus independent contractor. And
I think we have to see legislative change regardless of who's in office, just based on the number of people that are entering this independent gig worker, from the low end task rabbit, who's somebody who's just doing tasks, to the Uber drivers, to the high-end independent consultants that we're talking about delivering high-end long-term projects for customers. If this workforce continues to grow, and we saw the numbers early on, then it has to be addressed, and there will have to be clarity. Whether that comes at a state level or at a federal level remains to be seen.
All right, thanks, guys. The next question comes from Howard, and he says, employer branding efforts are mainly aimed at full-time employees, so how do we boost brand in the eyes of independent contractors?
Yeah, it's a great question. That's a real passion topic of mine. I think it comes back to that notion of, we believe every client should really strive to build not only an employer of choice brand, but also a client of choice brand. And how do you do that? I think you have to look at the full stack of how you attract and retain non-employee labor. I think some of the best practices out there include offering, traditional workers the opportunity for project work, and also really thinking through the type of work that you can unbundle from a traditional employee relationship and create more flexible worker opportunities. Because again, as Kieran said, I think the newer generations view a career very differently than some of us older folks on the call or in the room here. It used to be 20 years ago, when I look at my father's generation, right, it was punch a clock for 30 years and retire with a pension and a gold watch. The younger generations really view a career as nothing but a successive series of interesting projects, and where they're going to stay, where they can learn more and gain more experience and gain exposure, and they're going to leave when it becomes boring or unfun and go somewhere else.
So I think there's a combination of things. One is you can replicate some of the properties that you're using to drive brand within the full-time employee candidate and leverage it the same way. But a lot of what we're seeing is, as our customers start to develop their own talent pools to reuse these workers, they are starting to do their own campaigning, continuous reach outs after the workers leave, very aware of the onboarding and offboarding experience that the workers are having, for two reasons. One is they want these workers to come back. Two, it's a small enough community and word travels fast when workers had good experience or poor experience. So I think you can take a lot of what you've learned driving your brand at full-time candidates, leverage it, but also start to focus on the experience for the independent and how that comes across and kind of the experience they're left with when they leave.
All right, thanks guys for those terrific answers, and we'll go ahead and end our material for today's webcast. And everyone, please feel free to continue the discussion on Twitter and on LinkedIn. And I'll say one more thank you to everyone at TalentWave for making today's webcast happen. And to all of our HCI members, thank you once more for taking time out of your afternoon to spend with us. Remember once more to take a look at the upcoming HCI events by clicking the Attend a Conference link at the top of the page. And we do look forward to seeing everyone participate in another HCI learning opportunity soon.